The use of fossil fuels has a negative impact on our environment and on human health. Alternatives to fossil fuel include sustainable energy and nuclear power. We've discussed these in this course. We are now going to look at the most likely scenario for the future. So our future growth in population, energy use, and sustainable energy. We'll be looking at the business as usual scenario where we think taking present trends without doing something very different, this is probably where we'll be by 2035. We started this course looking at the IPAT equation. As you remember, IPAT stands for impact on the environment and on human health, depends upon population, affluence, and technology. And remember, technology kind of cuts both ways. If you go from a non-industrial technology to an industrial technology, that can have a really big impact. But some industrial technologies are more efficient and less harmful than others. We'll be looking then at the growth in each of these parameters: population, affluence, and technology. So let's begin with the current situation in the United States. The population in the U.S. is about 315 million people, so 0.3 billion. Energy use is 98 quads, or 98 QBTUs. 84% of the primary energy we use is fossil fuel energy, and there's a great deal of CO2 released from burning fossil fuel, and that amounts to about 5.6 billion metric tons. We will now look at the changes that are going to take place over the next 20-some years. And of course, nobody knows exactly what changes will take place, but we'll look at kind of the most likely business as usual scenario if we project from the present to the future, looking at current trends and current policies. This is where we're most likely to be in the year 2035. Unlike most other developed industrialized countries, the United States has a fairly rapidly growing population. And we anticipate between now and 2035 that U.S. population will increase by about 73 million people, which is about a 23% increase. One of the main reasons for that population increase is immigration, both legal and illegal immigration. This is different than in most other developed countries where population is either growing very slowly, staying stable, or actually somewhat declining. In spite of the 23% projected increase in U.S. population, energy consumption won't keep pace with that. So energy consumption is projected to rise by only 13%. This is because we expect that energy consumption will be more efficient in the future, that will put a bigger national emphasis on efficiency because of energy prices, and therefore energy won't grow as rapidly as population. So by 2035, even though U.S. population is projected to increase by about 23%, and energy use is projected to increase by about 13%, U.S. CO2 emissions is projected to only increase by 10%. Now, this happens because we're switching to some degree from fossil fuel energy to renewable energy, and we're switching from coal to natural gas. So this means that we have a smaller increase in CO2 emissions than might be anticipated from our energy consumption increase. On the other hand, we still have an increase in CO2 emissions of about 10%. So for U.S. growth over the next 22 years, there's good news and bad news. The good news is improved efficiency will mean that we get more energy use and more related wealth and benefits for a smaller energy cost. We also use more renewable energy. So this is good. The bad news is, in spite of this, there'll still be a CO2 increase by about 10%. So there will be increased impact on the environment. And this, for the United States, the biggest driver will be population increase. Other factors are reducing the impact, but population increase within the United States will raise that impact. Let's look at the global picture. The global population is about 7 billion. Current energy use is about 452 QBTUs. 83% of that primary energy use is in the form of fossil fuel. And globally, CO2 from energy being emitted is about 31 billion metric tons. So this is the present situation. Now we'll look at how we anticipate, how we project things will grow between now and 2035. As with the United States, we'll look at change in terms of population, energy use, and CO2 emissions, and we'll look at it now for the whole globe. This graph shows that global population will increase from its present level of about 7 billion up to about 8.4 billion in 2035. If you look at the graph in 2035, population looks like we'll be at about 8.4 billion. So that's a 1.4 billion people increase in the next 22 years, and that's about a 20% increase. So that's a big population growth. And all of those people will be wanting to have a good life the way you and I want to have a good life. The good news here is that it looks like population growth is slowing. So you look at this graph, it's an upward graph, but it's flattening off. So it looks like maybe by much later in the century, population will level off at about 10 billion. But anyway, between now and 2035, there'll be a growth of about 1.4 billion, most of that in developing countries. Now remember, global population is anticipated to increase by about 20%, but global energy consumption will jump up by 42%. This is because the less developed world is becoming more affluent and will become more affluent. So this is good news because people living at the poverty line or below the poverty line now will be much more likely to be living a more affluent lifestyle, will have a better quality of life. And so if you look at here the world at night, where we see where the energy is being consumed right now, we would guess in the next 20 or 30 years that there'll be a lot more energy use in China, India, South America, Africa. Between now and 2035, there'll be an increase in global population, and global population in general, and particularly in less developed countries, will become wealthier, and therefore they'll be using more energy. In fact, we just saw 42% more energy globally. So where will that new energy come from? Well, this chart shows that the bulk of new energy will come from the old reliable resources, that is fossil fuel, coal, natural gas, oil. However, about 30% of the energy increase will come from renewable energy and nuclear. And this is good because renewable energy and nuclear power do not release CO2 emissions, and there will be a positive benefit from that. So in spite of energy being projected to increase by 42%, global CO2 emissions will only increase by 35% because of a switch to more renewable energy and more nuclear. The bad news here is clear. A switch, even though there's switches to these non-carbon sources, there still is a very huge increase. We're talking about increasing global CO2 emissions by about a third in the next 22 years. So this is a big impact that we would expect from that level of CO2 emission increase. So there's some good news and bad news in global growth also. Population growth is slowing, Poverty will be reduced in the future because of greater energy use, and efficiency and renewables will increase. So there's some good news here. Some of the things that are being done globally will help the future situation. But the bad news is the combination of population increase and bringing people out of poverty, greater wealth, will cause a very large increase in CO2 emissions. So the real problem we have for the future is how to get the good news without having the bad news. So between now and 2035, global CO2 emissions will increase by about 35%. And the bulk of that, about 90% of it, will be increases from less developed countries. So that will lead us to the situation shown in this table, where the United States and Europe will be responsible for about 25% of global emissions, and China will be the leading global emitter, which it is now, but it will increase even more between now and 2035. In China, India, Africa, the less developed world will be responsible for the bulk of CO2 emissions. So that's the situation that we face in the near future up to 2035, and then after 2035. This is the situation we'll have to try to deal with in the future. So the bottom line here is, as we project current trends into the future, in spite of the trend of greater efficiency in energy use and switching to sustainable energy, that our current trends won't be enough. That by 2035, we'll see a very big increase in CO2 emissions, and therefore a very big increase in the potential for global climate change, negative environmental impact. So the question is, how do we get some of the benefits we've looked at, like pulling people in the developing world out of poverty and stop these negative impacts on the environment? This is what we'll deal with in the rest of the course.